I have the distinct pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Rachel Meyers. Dr. Meyers is an associate professor of classical studies at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. She earned her PhD in classical studies from Duke University after earning a BA in classics from Yale. She is an expert in Roman art and architecture, Roman social history, sex and gender in the ancient world. She co-directs a summer study abroad program called Roman Italy that centers on the art, culture, and history of ancient Rome and Italy. Her scholarship is centered broadly on Roman art, architecture, and social history, and more specifically on women in the Roman world and imperial representation and propaganda, which is the topic of her talk tonight. Her research encompasses large bodies of evidence, including marble portraits, portrait statues, coinage, architectural monuments, written documents, and inscriptions. She has earned multiple grants and awards for her research and teaching, including most recently a Center for the Excellence in Arts and Humanities research grant from Iowa State University in 2019. Tonight, Dr. Meyers will tell us about her research on the practice of benefaction, which is the philanthropic activity of funding public works, structures, entertainment, events, and other goods. As she is researching how it is conducted by women in the Roman Empire. And so I hope you will all join me in a digital round of applause and welcome Dr. Meyers. And I'll turn over the podium to you.
Okay, let's see if I can then share my screen again. Okay, are you seeing my screen now? Okay, terrific. Well, thanks so much, Deb. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight to address not only people here in Iowa, but maybe even around the country as well tuning in. That is definitely an advantage of these Zoom era meetings. And I'm really excited for the chance to talk about my research again on female benefactors. I feel like I've really been missing out on kind of the communal aspects of meetings and talking about my research with others. So the topic of female benefaction is one that I have been working on for, I guess, quite a few years. And so this evening, what I will talk about is just to give a little bit of background on the practice of benefaction, and then some of my findings related in particular to women, as Deb mentioned already. Although Deb just gave a little bit of a clarification as far as what do I mean by benefaction, I can clarify or expand on that just a little bit more, because the term benefaction is used in the study of the Romans in several different contexts. It's not the concept of patronage, as in the patron-client relationship, or in the sense of supporting a writer or an artist, as we might also think about it. So in the scope of my work, benefaction refers to a variety of philanthropic activity, whether that's financing construction projects and public works, lots of temples or buildings around the forum, theaters and amphitheaters, and even decoration and repairs to existing buildings. Under goods, I group a variety of gifts that include not only banquets and different types of entertainment in various formats, but also some of the really expensive statuary, not just your everyday kind of statuary, but some of the really expensive types. And I'll be giving an example in a few minutes. And then in my category of cash, I include endowments and bequests. Also, very often the one-time kind of handouts that are called sportuli. And these are a really common type of gift that we see both by men and women, as generally they were only a few coins offered to a certain segment of society. So these different acts of benefaction were, of course, given for a variety of reasons, though unfortunately for us, we usually don't have the reasons. They're not stated in our evidence for the benefaction. But there is one underlying thread, wanting to be noticed within one's community. Achieving and maintaining a level of standing within that community. Of course, Roman society was based on a hierarchical social political system, but it was one that allowed for quite a few opportunities for social mobility. We know that the nobles wanted to maintain their elevated status. And then, of course, there were other people who were trying to carve out space for themselves with their newly acquired wealth. So one thing that I've learned in looking at these benefactors, I've tried to stop calling them just the wealthy, but I borrow a term from Emily Hemmelrich and call them the financial elite, because it's not just the wealthiest of people who made these donations. We can see that people are coming from different segments of society. And so this term of the financial elite kind of expresses that a little bit more broadly. They're sponsoring buildings and other kinds of projects to assert their place within their community. And just a little bit as far as status goes, because I won't talk about it too much more specifically, really, very often, especially with the female benefactors, it's kind of a guessing game as to what status they had, if they were from senatorial families or other segments of the population, unless they had a bunch of named relatives in their inscription. But okay, I'll touch on that a little bit more later on as well. So just to back up for another moment, I wanted to explain how I arrived at the topic of benefaction in the Roman Empire many years ago, because I see it as really a crucial aspect of how I approach my role in studying the ancient world. For years, actually going back to my PhD studies, I'd been examining the portrait statues of the Antonine imperial family all around the empire. And I'd been gathering and analyzing the portraits, the statue remains, the inscribed statue bases, and I was also exploring the various display contexts whenever we knew them, like the nymphaeum here of Heroides and Frigilla at Olympia. In my mind, everything goes together. Studying just the portrait or the statue or just the inscription in isolation is only telling us so much. But when we can combine these different pieces of evidence, we can learn more about the subjects and about the city or town. So I started noticing who was responsible for paying for all of these nice statues of the imperial family set up in different areas around the empire. And I'd been thinking about the questions of agency and how much control the imperial family had over their image and the kind of messages that were coming out of the imperial court. And I noted really quite a range in the names of the donors and also in how much information about the donors we were getting in the inscriptions themselves. So I'm still investigating sculptural displays and benefactors. Sometimes I focus on one more than the other or try to combine everything. It tends to be like these kind of massive projects, but that's kind of how I process all of these sculptural displays, is really trying to get at them from every possible angle that I can. Just to give a little bit of background, I don't want to dwell on some of this material too much. I want to get into some of my own findings, but I feel it necessary to just name drop a few names here. I think anyone who has done any work on benefaction, gift giving, has worked or has looked at Paul Vane's work from the 1970s. I would say that probably a lot of scholars who are working on benefaction don't necessarily follow all of his conclusions. I certainly don't, but certainly as someone who was foundational in this whole topic, his work can't be ignored. And Van Bremen and Zwiderhoek, who are listed here, have done quite a bit of work on women in the case of Van Bremen, and more the male donors in the case of Zwiderhoek from the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, and even going back to the Hellenistic period. And I would say that Emily Hemmelrich has been a great model for my own. I think that we were at about the same time, unbeknownst to one another, working on very similar issues as far as women's roles in the Roman Empire and the practice of benefaction as well. And so her work is immensely impactful in my own approach to this evidence. So, speaking of evidence, generally what I am dealing with are inscriptions like the inscribed statue base that you're seeing here of Gavia Maxima. Sometimes we also have statuary that remains, but it's often hard to match up statue bases and portraits or statue bodies. Just depends upon how things have been found and excavated. Sometimes we also have building remains and the dedicatory inscriptions on different types of structures that will give us evidence for donations. Ancient authors like Cicero and Seneca and Pliny the Younger, they sort of wax poetic about this practice of gift giving. They're a little more philosophical as far as the responsibilities that go along with gift giving. But, no surprise to anyone, I'm sure, they're generally talking about men and not talking about women at all. But I've still found them useful to try to understand more about the practice, the context of benefaction in Roman society in general. So as I have gotten into this research, and gathering more and more inscriptions, spreadsheets full of all of this data, trying to keep track of the different provinces and the dates and the donors and the types of donations. And I've approached my research by not only looking at the single examples or clusters of examples and the extent of any one type of donation, but I've also approached things from a quantitative method by really looking at the numbers. I was never really a number cruncher, but I found myself dealing with lots and lots of data here and trying to really understand the different functions and values of benefaction in the Roman world by looking at the geographical distribution of gifts, how the type of gift changes over time and over place, trying to understand when we do know the social stature, the class within Roman society, trying to look at any trends there. So that's kind of how I have gotten into this area of research. So one of the first questions that I wanted to ask of all of this material as I was gathering it was whether women made dedications more often with their family members, particularly male relatives or a husband, or if they were making these gifts on their own. Because some of the older scholarship suggested, without really any evidence, that women more often just kind of were listed as part of family dedications, or if their husband made some kind of a gift, that they were listed just as, like, I don't know, a courtesy, maybe. Wasn't really ever clear. And as I was gathering all of these and I'm reading all of the inscriptions, and I just see example after example of just a woman's name being listed. So, that's where I was looking at the numbers then. So what I came up with, here's sort of the first step, was gathering the benefactions where women were involved, just keeping my sights on the western provinces of the Roman Empire, and breaking down the benefactions by different groups. So you can see that architectural projects were the most popular type of gift. But banquets and other kinds of goods were also very prominent. And then the other types of gifts, such as public works, that's a kind of a broad category. These were not as common. A lot of inscriptions do not specify any particular gift, but there are a number of examples where a woman is being honored with a statue, and the text says something like, because of her merit, that she's being awarded this statue, or some other kind of generic language like that. So the type of gift isn't specified. Okay, let me pull out an example. This is like my favorite example that I like to talk about. We have a woman here in the 1st century CE, Corellia Galla Papiana, and she bequeathed, so she set out in her will, gifts of 100,000 sesterces, which is a chunk of money, each to the towns of Minturnae and Cassina in Italy, so that pastry and sweet wine, that's crustulum et mulsum, could be provided annually on her birthday. I love this example because I like to think that if I had hundreds of thousands of dollars, that I would set up an endowment like this. I mean, wine, pastry, it's like the perfect combination here. So these large sums of money, what would have happened is that they would have been invested by the towns, and so that the returns on the investments then would provide these delicacies for many years to come to these 2 different towns. And what's even more interesting to note is that, well, one, we have the amount actually listed in the inscription, and these testamentary foundations that Papiana set up are the largest sums recorded for any kind of public feast sponsored by a woman in the Western Roman Empire. So there are many different types of banquets that can be provided. This is actually probably on the cheaper side, actually. But it means that this is the gift that just keeps on giving for many, many years. In this inscription, we do not have it specified the recipients of the gift. In certain inscriptions, it is specified which parts of the community are eligible to come to the banquet or to receive the gift. The crustulum et mulsum was sometimes also accompanied by a little bit of money, a few coins as well. So with this kind of example, I mean, lots and lots of money at stake here. Looking at something like this brings up the question, okay, well, how much money did these women have at their disposal, and how much of it were they using to undertake civic munificence? So we can look at a few other examples here as well. Just to give you kind of a range of some of these other gifts. So architectural projects would have been certainly among the most expensive types, depending upon whether it was completely new construction or if it was just decoration or restorations that were being undertaken. We don't have very many recorded figures for buildings. We do have some evidence from North Africa, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But buildings could range. We see something on the low end like 6,000 sesterces, which would probably just be for maybe some repairs or a little bit of decoration, all the way up to 200,000 sesterces. And there we're talking new construction of a large building for sure. So with the case of Patria Fortunata, she not only financed a temple, but then when the temple was being dedicated, she also gave sportuli to the decurions. So here's an example where the recipients of the gift were actually specified. So a small handout to the decurions, and then a banquet to the people, which probably doesn't actually mean every single person in the town, but rather a segment of the population. In any case, quite a few people in the town of Thuga were certainly benefiting from Patria Fortunata's dedication here. Earlier, I mentioned statues, and that I certainly am not talking about every single statue because that would just be millions and millions. Statues were so ubiquitous in Roman cities, as we know, but there was a type of statue, I like to call them the fancy statues, which is a small percentage, maybe about 6 to 7% of all of the benefactions that I've gathered. And it's this type of statue that I include. So, you know, marble statues, again, costs can vary from a few thousand to over 20,000. But a silver statue is going to go way up to perhaps 50,000. So we have this example coming to us from Italica, where Vivia Modesta, who was originally from Mauritania, according to the inscription, she donated a silver statue to Victoria Augusta, and it's specified in the inscription, and this is pretty common, that 132 pounds of silver were used for the statue, but not just a silver statue. The statue was adorned with an array of very expensive jewelry, pearl pendant earrings, 40 gems, 8 sapphires, and a gold crown encrusted with jewels. So some of these gems may have been rings or necklaces. They aren't actually specified completely in the inscription. Some necklaces and bracelets are included as well. So this statue is just literally dripping with very, very fancy and expensive gems as well. But as I said, that's not a common type, but certainly we do have some examples of women undertaking a particularly fancy statue. Infrastructure projects were usually carried out by towns and cities But there are instances when a private citizen financed a stretch of road or a stretch of the city wall, water conduits, and even aqueducts. Like this particular example of Gavia Maxima, who donated 600,000 sesterces for an aqueduct in Verona. And this is a small subset, about 6% of all of the benefactions that I've gathered. So again, not a huge group, but some of the more expensive. If you're talking about water conduits or road or wall, those are structures where the price is definitely going to be pretty high. Okay, so far I've been showing you examples of only women on their own, right? And my question was, okay, are women donating on their own or with other people? Well, okay, finally, I'll give you an example where we have Albuquia Candida, who added to a benefaction that had been undertaken by her husband way up in northern Italy in the town of Novaria. So her husband had started to restore the baths there. And then she, in her will, again, left an additional 200,000 sesterces. So here is one example where we see a woman and her husband's name is also a part of the inscription. So adding on to something that seems like he must have started previously, but the inscription isn't clear if it was like 10 years ago, 1 year ago, 3 months ago, just that she is also contributing to this particular gift. Okay, so let's look at some more fun charts. I was also never like a chart person, and now I have about 1 million charts. So breaking this down a little bit, I talked about architectural benefactions and looking at the examples just from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries where there are the higher numbers. In fact, you can already see in the 3rd century that the numbers are really on the decline, and in the 4th century, very, very few. But in this particular category of benefactions, we see that women on their own are making up a huge portion of all of the donations. So in the 1st century, they are donating 38 structures all on their own and only 13 jointly with a male family member. And another category, banquets and shows, these were a smaller category, but extremely popular in the 2nd century. And this was definitely a category, perhaps because of the lower price, that women were able to donate very, very frequently on their own. So this could be a variety of theatrical performances and different kinds of spectacles and different kinds of banquets, not always specified in the inscriptions. So, okay, here's everything then from the 1st through the 4th centuries in these different categories. You can see how the architectural donations there really outdo every other category. And, you know, what I concluded then, it was very obvious once I started looking at the numbers in this way that women actually sponsored many more benefactions on their own than with male family members. So, you know, what are we taking away? What are we learning about women and about Roman society? That women had the financial resources to afford often the costliest expenditures, and that overwhelmingly women were taking on these projects of civic munificence on their own. So we can see this evidence is illustrating how women acted publicly in ways that were socially and legally accessible to them, which included following the same kind of civic ideals as male donors in certain donations. That when you compare, and tackling the body of evidence for male donors is a much bigger task, which I've only partly done and no one else has undertaken. So it's not possible to compare only female donors and only male donors in a one-to-one basis for most places around the empire. But when we can look at like small clusters of donations or donations in the same cities or the same regions, we see pretty similar trends between the male and female donors, that it's not that women are only taking on the cheapest kinds of gifts for their cities because they didn't have the money. Very often they're taking on some of the most expensive types of projects, indicating that, in fact, some women really had a lot of money, and this was an avenue that was open to them. It was accessible to them in many places around the empire. Just for a little bit more of a geographical breakdown, and I show this graph with like an extreme word of caution in that, well, so one of the issues, not only with this project, but with a number of different research questions, is just the mismatch in the extent of excavation in a lot of areas around the empire, the extent of publication of excavations that have been done, and then the accessibility of publication reports. Very often I have found that excavations done in various places around Spain are published in special issues of journals or publications particular to a university that generally don't have wide circulation, and they're pretty difficult to track down. So I think we're going to, no matter what, probably find a lot of evidence for benefactions in Italy. But my guess is that as certain areas are a little bit further excavated and the results are published and we have a chance to really review more evidence, that we will find more examples of benefactions in other provinces as well. Lusitania is a very good example of this. There are really very few inscriptions that have been found of benefactions by men or women there. And I think that has more to do with the extent of investigation in that particular province. But it's interesting, one of the things that I look at, like, why were banquets more popular in Baetica than they were relatively in Italy, for example, or architecture very popular in Italy versus in other places. That's kind of another piece of the puzzle as I continue looking at some of these numbers and gathering some more research. I've also been looking at the numbers by the different centuries, and are there differences in the joint and solo benefactions over time as well. And there are some trends to notice. So in the first century, women made 78% of the benefactions on their own. And then in the second century, it goes to 76.3. So it's a pretty marginal decrease. And then in the third century, which I didn't put up here, it goes down to 70%, 71% really. So the proportion of civic munificence involving women remained quite high, but the percentage of the donations by women on their own drops a little bit over these 3 centuries. And I think that's something that needs a little bit more investigating as well. So that's kind of all on the research question, are women donating on their own or together with family members? And while going through all of this material for several years, or reading many other books and articles that's one way or another mentioned the practice of benefaction, you just kept reading the same names over and over, like, oh, Eumakia of Pompeii. Like, who doesn't know about Eumakia? And she was always kind of the example that was dropped. And you know, I'm amassing hundreds and hundreds of female benefactors. And I was like, how come no one's talking about these other women? They're doing really cool things like Eumakia as well. And so I chose to focus on the Roman provinces on the Iberian Peninsula, because this was an area that at first, when I started looking, I was like, oh, great. There's hardly any scholarship on the Spanish provinces, especially on benefactors. So this is like going to be a gold mine for me to really get into. Well, then what I realized that actually it's because, kind of like what I mentioned a moment ago, many of the people for the last several decades who had been working on various excavations or research topics in the Spanish provinces are from these areas. They're publishing in Spanish or Portuguese or even Catalan. And these publications don't have very wide circulation. So the Anglophone world wasn't really taking notice of all of the scholarship that was being published in these other languages. And, you know, one has to be fluent enough to read and to find out that, in fact, a number of scholars have been doing some pretty interesting work. But still not, I still didn't find the answers to some of the questions that I wanted here in Spain. And in an effort to bring some other examples of amazing benefactors out to the broader world, I was focusing in on these different provinces. So I have a group of about 350 inscriptions from these different provinces that give evidence for female benefaction. And so I was really just zeroing in here then on some of the regional differences and, again, the chronological differences as well. And I'll just show one more example here of Bibia Cranita, who bequeathed 200,000 sesterces for a temple to Diana and Apollo in the town of Aruki in Hispania Baetica. And this bequest was the largest figure known for a building in all of Spain, whether male or female donors. So kind of pulling out some of my biggest, best examples here, where we have more information about the nature of the donation. So as I said, we don't have a ton of information as far as the range of prices for different buildings. Duncan Jones has compiled hundreds and hundreds of figures from North Africa and Italy, but these texts aren't just limited to the benefactions, but pretty much anytime any amount was stated in a text. So from his figures in Roman Africa, building costs are generally below 100,000 sesterces. Most are in the 20 to 50,000 sesterce range. So again, this is a really massive gift. It's also noteworthy because the amount is actually included here. I'm probably choosing the worst examples because the number of inscriptions that actually give an amount is probably around 7 or 8% of inscriptions, but they're also the most interesting to look at. So I guess I kind of pulled out all these examples. But generally, we don't have the sum of money that was donated, just that a person sponsored the construction of a building or repairs or decoration. Another thing that is particularly noteworthy about this particular dedication is that there is no mention of a husband or other male relatives apart from her filiation as the daughter of Gaius, right? So she's Bibia, daughter of Gaius. And that's noteworthy, not just because she was doing this all on her own, but because generally women in the Roman world are known through their relationships with men, whether it's a father, a husband, or some other relative. Very often their names are mentioned, especially a husband, if a woman is married. So, what happened here? Perhaps she was from a very well-known family. In fact, the Bibius family is known in a number of cities across Spain. It's not clear if it's like her branch of the Bibius family or not. So just like our good old Eumachia, pull her out again. In the inscriptions in Pompeii, Eumachia is designated only as the daughter of Lucius. So in that instance, perhaps also here, if she was from such a well-known family, the townspeople would have known who she was, and it wouldn't have been necessary to give her a fuller description. It's also possible that by this point, her own husband was deceased. If she was married, that he predeceased her. That would have been a pretty common occurrence. Or even that her own family was more distinguished than her husband's family. So it wasn't really to her advantage to mention her husband's family, but just to keep her own name there. She is noted to be a priestess, a sacerdos. Probably she was a priestess of Diana, given that she's dedicating a temple to Apollo and Diana. We see in inscriptions that Diana was one of the most commonly named deities mentioned for priestesses in the Western provinces. One of the things that we don't know is whether she gave this benefaction when she was actually the priestess, or before or after. Those little nuggets of information are not given. The banquet that she gave here, probably just for the people who were of the decurial class, what I call like the town leaders, essentially. Banquets were really linked to the status of the individuals. And the thing that is probably opposite in our minds is that the people who were more important, who actually were probably wealthier, received banquets more often than other people. And the types of commodities that they consumed were probably better than what the ordinary residents, when they were included, were given. So, giving a banquet when a building was being dedicated is something that was pretty typical and certainly would get the attention of the people in the town. Oops, there we go. Okay. So just a few other things here to say. I wanted to give a little bit of a geographical breakdown within the three provinces in the Iberian Peninsula. So you can see some of the differences, and certainly Baetica provides us with just more information than the other two. And so I think that with future research that these numbers are likely to change. I found it interesting that in Hispania Tarraconensis, there are quite a few more architectural works that were sponsored over the same in Baetica, where statues were a more popular gift. And in Lusitania, you know, there's not a huge, overwhelming winner here. As you can see, things are a little bit more evenly split, but I think that'll probably change. And I'm still gathering my thoughts on what are some of the deeper implications of why more architectural works versus statues, or why is it more common to sponsor public works over other types of gifts according to the place. So with all of these benefactions by women, we can make a few different conclusions about Roman society. So here are some of my thoughts as I've been looking at all of these numbers and reading through hundreds of different inscriptions. That we see evidence for the increasing autonomy to women granted by the law in the early imperial period, through their increased involvement in civic munificence. So in the very, very late 1st century BCE, we have a few benefactions. I didn't even include them here. Then in the 1st century, it picks up. The 2nd century is really where we see the most as more and more women gained the legal right to be more involved in public. That women are acting on their own without male family members, without guardians. Overall, about 75% of their donations are completely on their own. They're very commonly funding some of the most expensive benefactions, architectural works, and very elaborate statues. And that some of the inscriptions where we do have the costs listed are some of the most expensive known in entire regions. So women are definitely giving some really, really expensive gifts. While women were certainly limited in the public roles that they could play, it's clear through this work, through the work of others, that they could contribute financially to their communities. They could also serve as priestesses. These were some of the appropriate roles for women in the Roman Empire. About 1/3 of the female benefactors in this group were also priestesses, but as I mentioned earlier, we don't always know, actually we almost never know when they gave their gift. If it was while they were a priestess, before or after, I think that connection definitely needs some further examination. The broad group of the financial elite is certainly involved in both of these aspects, in the priesthoods as well as in the civic munificence. So that is where I will end. I really thank everyone for attending this evening, and I'm happy to take some questions, I think, if we still have some time.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that really fascinating talk. Wow, you've done a lot of work as well. That's an amazing amount of data gathering for sure. Yeah, so everyone please join me in a digital round in the reactions. There's an applause button. Thank you again for this wonderful talk. If anyone has any questions, you are more than welcome to raise your digital hand. That's in the reactions and I'll call on you. Or you can put them in chat if you would like as well. So yeah, I'm hoping I can always kick it off, but here we go. Okay, so Sadie Richter has a question. She asks, do the men create the wills for the women? If so, is it possible she did not really contribute?
Yeah, good question. So Yeah, well, some of these details would be hard to know. So the legal changes that I was kind of obliquely referring to, the right of three children, which came to women who had three children, and one of the privileges that they were given was that they had the ability to make their own will. Now, if you mean like, was the man actually there writing it? Did he go to down to the forum and, register the will? I do not know have not come across anything that would allow us to really get into the particulars on that question. But even, so I trying to say about four things all at once here. As we move forward in the imperial period, more and more women would have had the ability to create their own wills and therefore to have more control over their finances. And my reading of the legal stipulations is that women were able to create their wills and actually have their own control over their funds, depending upon the type of marriage that they entered into, which was by this point in the imperial period much more of a much better for the woman, I guess. Men really couldn't have control over their finances.
Very interesting. Abby Whitford asks, do you think that, oh wait, sorry, let me make sure I didn't miss any. Lauren is first. Did their will only matter if the husband had passed before her, or would it have caused conflict if the women would give away their finances rather than give it to their husbands or families?
Yeah, that's a that is also a tough question, I think, to know about. In some cases, trying to think of a couple examples where I've read that it seems as though a husband may actually help carry out a wife's wishes after her death. So the will didn't only matter after the husband had died, because I think that the children could also be involved. I'm not like a super expert here on all of the testamentary law. I've read a little bit there. I think that one of the reasons that the type of marriage changed in the Roman Empire was because of conflict between women and their own birth family, their natal family, and being a part of their husband's family. And people wanted to be able to control their family's money more, so that in the old style of marriage, a husband could have more access to his wife's finances. And I think that's where there would have been some problems. Fortunately or unfortunately, I guess, or probably in relation really to some of the changes in the laws, we find more examples of female benefactors. So I think there are some avenues here that can be explored a little bit further to kind of get into some of these deep questions in the law code.
Interesting stuff for sure. Abby asks, do you think that women's gifts to the community were appreciated by the community, or acknowledged that they were a gift from the woman, possibly any jealousy of wealth?
Yeah, well, so the whole part of this practice of benefaction, which I guess I just kind of skipped over, the whole idea here is that men and women, right? Okay, so they're giving these gifts to their communities. And, a whole other category is people who give gifts to private associations, which I'm not getting into. I'm just really talking about more public gifts here. Is that it was like a a give and a take between the communities. So that's why I tend not to use the word philanthropy, because it's not just like for the love of my community that I'm donating something, it's so that I'm getting something in return. The vast majority of our evidence comes from statue bases. So it's these women are being acknowledged, their gifts are being acknowledged by having a statue put up in the forum, or in very public venues. And so that's the community's acceptance of the gift. Jealousy, I think that there probably are some aspects of maybe not jealousy, but competition. That's one thing that I was hoping that I could learn a little bit more about, and I've realized that it's pretty much impossible to know, like, if, Bibia Cranita, she gives 200,000, like, is someone else going to try to outdo her and give 250,000? I think, yes, that probably did happen, because I mean, the Greeks, the Romans, they were not strangers to the idea of competition. So I can only imagine that within towns, people were trying to one up, like, oh, that family over there, well, we've got to make our mark. We're going to put up a theater, and so I think there was jealousy in that respect.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, why else would you put the money amount in the inscription if not to kind of do a brag a bit?
Yeah, exactly. And I think maybe there's such a small number of inscriptions that mention the amount, because it was maybe like a little, okay, you want to get recognition for what you've done, but let's not be over the top. And I don't know, that's my guess.
Yeah, I was wondering if, like, the number when they gave money, was it, or when they listed the amount, was it for smaller things in general, so that they could say, like, look, I know this is small, but I actually spent a lot of money on it? Or because architectural seems like a big thing, and so you don't necessarily need to brag about that. But
yeah, sometimes it's 4,000 or 5,000 sesterces, so a pretty small amount of money that's being recorded. There are like a couple really specific. It's like 4,951 sesterces, like very specific amounts that are listed as well. But I think that, gifts like banquets, the wine and pastry would have been a pretty small number, even though the initial gift was so large, but it was meant to be for maybe 20 years.
Interesting, for sure. Do you have time for a few more questions?
Sure, yeah.
So Jack, joining us from Atlanta, asks, do you know of any evidence of female benefactors in Britain?
I have not found any evidence in Britain. Do you know of any? I would be happy to hear about it. I have not seen any.
Yeah, the majority of your evidence, almost all of your evidence, is inscriptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any interest in looking at anything? I don't know how you would even know, though, besides if an inscription was noted that it was given by a woman.
Right. And so that's one of the arguments in certain provinces, some of the northern provinces that don't have a very rich body of epigraphy anyway, that maybe the practice of benefaction was in fact more widespread. We just don't have the evidence because they weren't really in the habit of recording things in stone.
Yeah, definitely the case. Like, how else would we know, right?
Yeah.
Sarah Horvat asked, what % of the female population was able to be benefactors? Were they more concentrated in areas like cities, or was it town to town that the wealthiest were expected to be benefactors?
I have not looked at the broader demographic questions. I think trying to estimate the population anywhere is probably more computation than I'm willing to take on right now. I know that there are certain scholars who've come up with different population estimates, even by place. So I unfortunately I don't have an answer as far as how many women in any particular town. I mean, just given the evidence, if we have 3 people in a town of I don't know, 50,000 people, that's a minuscule percentage, but how reflective of the actual practice is that? Were they more concentrated in towns or cities? Yeah, typically, although that's also where more excavations have been done. Wherever there is a known town, a cluster of buildings, you're probably more likely to find the type of evidence that would record the benefactions. So it varies a little bit, but even in some small towns, we'll find a couple examples of benefactors. Did I answer all of that? Were the wealthiest
I think so.
expected
Yeah,
to
there's
be,
also like a tithing or a tax question.
Okay.
Like, was there ever any like expectation, written or otherwise, that well, let me read the whole thing. So was there anything written into law via government expectations that there were civic duties, that these were civic duties of people who possessed certain wealth? Sort of like tithing or tax, getting the attention of higher government?
So not exactly, but here's where the connection between the priesthoods and benefaction comes in, because to take on a priesthood for men or women, they had to pay a certain amount, depends upon the priesthood, could be a few thousand sesterces or more. They had to give an amount, and sometimes it seems as though that amount could be used for the public good in some way. But most of the benefactions go way above and beyond a few thousand sesterces. So there is a connection between kind of having the expectation that you need to pay something. There've been arguments that it was, especially in the Greek East, that the wealthiest were expected to contribute things that towns wouldn't have been able to afford, various elements of infrastructure or public works. But I don't buy that. The types of gifts that most benefactors are giving are not like the necessary structures. They're the extraneous for the most part, unless they're actually directing their funds to repairing a road or something like that. So there isn't anything in law that commands the wealthiest people to give at any particular rate.
And kind of along those same lines, Jillian asks, I'll just summarize it. Is there, like, from the amounts that are donated or estimated to have donated, what percentage of their wealth might that have been? Like, for example, women donating smaller benefactions are in one class, if you can tell that from the inscription, versus larger donations from the highest classes.
Yeah, so I haven't worked out these figures myself, but I think it's from Duncan Jones again, who's done, from the 60s through the 80s, did a lot of work in crunching numbers. And I believe his estimate is that most of the benefactors were maybe giving 10% of their wealth.
Okay.
So actually a pretty small amount, which means that some of them were very, very wealthy.
Interesting. Yeah, that is a lot of money.
Yeah.
For sure. Awesome. Well, wow, this is just an amazing, I'm excited to see the final product when you get this out, because this is an impressive amount of work. Thank you for this.
Yeah.
insane. Yeah. So Sadie says as well, like research is insanely impressive and immense. Thank you for sharing this. So yeah, everyone all around, thank you so much for sharing this with us, Dr. Meyers. We really, really appreciate it.